In the scorching heat of 1886 Arizona Territory, where hatred ran deeper than the dry riverbeds and blood feuds lasted generations, one desperate act of human kindness would shatter every rule of frontier warfare. When Apache warriors appeared at the gates of a failing ranch, thirsting for the one thing more precious than gold in the desert, they expected bullets. Instead, they found something that would change the course of American history forever. This is the extraordinary true story of how a broken-down cattleman's simple gesture of sharing clean water with his sworn enemies transformed bitter warfare into an unlikely alliance, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hatred isn't a gun. It's a cup of water offered to a thirsty stranger. The sun had not yet painted the eastern mountains when Thomas McKenna stepped onto the cracked wooden porch of his ranch house, his boots echoing hollow against the weathered boards. The Arizona Territory stretched before him like a vast, unforgiving canvas of red earth and scattered mesquite, beautiful in its harshness yet merciless to those who dared call it home. Thomas pulled his worn hat low over his eyes and surveyed what remained of his once promising cattle operation with the grim resignation of a man watching his dreams die slowly in the desert heat. 5 years earlier, Thomas had arrived from Kansas with 300 head of prime cattle, a young wife named Sarah, and enough optimism to fill the Grand Canyon. The land agent in Tucson had painted pictures of endless grass and reliable water sources, spinning tales of fortunes made in beef and leather. What Thomas found instead was a harsh reality that ground down hope like wind-carved sandstone. The promised grass existed only in scattered patches that disappeared with each passing season, and the water sources proved as reliable as a gambler's promise. Sarah had endured 3 brutal summers before the consumption took her during the 4th winter. Thomas had buried her in the small cemetery behind the ranch house, beneath a simple wooden cross that bore only her name and the dates that bookend her brief life in this unforgiving place. Since then, he had worked the land alone, watching his herd dwindle from 300 to barely 50 head, each lost animal representing another nail in the coffin of his American dream. The ranch itself told the story of his declining fortunes. The barn leaned precariously to one side, its roof patched with whatever materials Thomas could scavenge from abandoned homesteads. The corral fencing had gaps wide enough for a cow to walk through, held together more by prayer than proper construction. The well that had once provided sweet, clean water now yielded only a trickle during the best of times, and went completely dry when the desert heat peaked in midsummer. Thomas had tried everything to save his operation. He had sold off parcels of his land to neighboring ranchers, used the money to buy feed during the worst droughts, and even taken work in town when the cattle couldn't provide enough income to survive. But each solution proved temporary, and the desert seemed determined to reclaim what human ambition had tried to tame. The local bank in Tucson had already foreclosed on 3 nearby ranches, and Thomas knew his own notice would arrive soon enough. The isolation weighed on him almost as heavily as the financial burden. The nearest neighbor lived 12 miles to the south, and the small settlement of Willow Creek lay 20 miles northeast along a trail that became impassable during the summer months. Days would pass without Thomas speaking to another human being, the silence broken only by the lowing of his remaining cattle and the endless whisper of wind through the desert brush. But isolation brought dangers beyond loneliness. The Apache Wars had raged across the territory for decades, a bitter conflict that had claimed thousands of lives on both sides. Thomas had heard the stories in town, whispered accounts of raids and massacres, of families found dead in their burned-out homesteads, of wagon trains that simply vanished into the vast emptiness of the desert. The Army maintained a presence at Fort Bowie, 40 miles to the east, but their patrols covered hundreds of square miles of hostile territory. A lone rancher like Thomas existed at the mercy of forces far beyond his control. The Apache themselves remained largely invisible to Thomas, though their presence haunted every aspect of frontier life. Occasionally, he would find tracks around his water sources or discover that some of his cattle had disappeared during the night without explanation. The local wisdom held that the Apache took what they needed and killed anyone who tried to stop them. Thomas had armed himself with a Winchester rifle and a Colt revolver, but he harbored no illusions about his chances if a war party decided his ranch looked promising. Local tensions had escalated dramatically in recent months. Geronimo, the legendary Apache war leader, had escaped from the San Carlos reservation yet again, taking with him a band of warriors who seemed to appear and disappear like desert mirages. Army patrols crisscrossed the territory in pursuit, but the Apache knew this land in ways that no white soldier could hope to match. They moved through landscapes that would kill an inexperienced traveler in hours, finding water and shelter where others saw only death. Thomas had witnessed the aftermath of this guerrilla warfare firsthand during his monthly trips to Willow Creek for supplies. The settlement lived in a state of constant fear, its residents jumping at shadows and organizing armed patrols that accomplished little except burning through ammunition they could barely afford. The general store owner, a practical man named Henderson, had installed iron bars on his windows and kept a shotgun within arm's reach at all times. The local saloon had become an unofficial headquarters for vigilante groups that talked big about hunting down Apache raiders, but rarely ventured far from town. The economic impact of the conflict extended far beyond the immediate violence. Freight wagons traveled only in heavily armed convoys, driving up the cost of everything from flour to ammunition. Insurance companies refused to cover properties in the territory, and Eastern investors had stopped funding new ventures. The territorial government offered bounties for Apache scalps, a practice that attracted the worst sort of men and did nothing to reduce the actual threat. Thomas had seen these scalp hunters in town, hard-faced men who boasted about their kills and spent their blood money on whiskey and women. Yet despite the constant tension, Thomas felt a grudging respect for his Apache adversaries. They had survived in this harsh landscape for generations, adapting to conditions that challenged even the hardiest European settlers. Their knowledge of the desert's secrets far exceeded anything Thomas had learned during his years in the territory. They could find water where others saw only rock, locate game where the land appeared lifeless, and move across terrain that would cripple a cavalry horse without leaving a trace. The morning routine that had sustained Thomas through 5 years of hardship began with checking his remaining livestock. The 50 head of cattle that constituted his entire fortune grazed in a natural basin about a half-mile from the ranch house, protected on 3 sides by red rock formations that provided both shelter and security. Thomas counted each animal carefully, looking for signs of disease or injury that could further reduce his dwindling herd. Every cow represented potential income, and the loss of even one animal brought him closer to the inevitable failure that seemed to lurk on the horizon. Water remained his most critical concern. The ranch's original well had been dug during the first year, when Thomas still believed the land agent's promises about reliable aquifers. That well had provided adequate water for his family and livestock during the early years, but changing weather patterns and increased demand had reduced its output to barely enough for basic survival. Thomas had considered hiring a crew to dig a new well, but the cost exceeded his remaining resources, and there was no guarantee that a new hole would yield better results. The water situation had forced Thomas to develop an elaborate conservation system that would have impressed an engineer. He collected every drop of rainwater in a network of barrels and canvas sheets, recycled wash water for the vegetable garden that provided most of his food, and rationed drinking water for both himself and his animals with mathematical precision. During the driest months, he had driven his cattle to a natural spring 8 miles away, losing precious time and energy in the daily trek. The spring itself represented one of the territory's most valuable resources, a reliable source of clean water that bubbled up from deep underground and formed a small oasis of green vegetation in the surrounding desert. Thomas had no legal claim to the spring, but tradition and necessity had established his right to use it when his own well ran dry. He had never encountered another human being at the spring during his many trips, though he often found evidence that others had visited the site. Animal tracks around the spring told stories of the desert's hidden life. Deer, rabbits, and countless smaller creatures depended on this water source for survival, creating a delicate ecosystem that existed nowhere else in the immediate area. Thomas had learned to read these tracks like a frontier newspaper, identifying not just species but individual animals that returned regularly to drink. The variety of wildlife around the spring reminded him that even in this harsh environment, life found ways to flourish. But the spring also attracted predators. Mountain lion tracks appeared regularly in the soft earth around the water's edge, and Thomas had twice encountered rattlesnakes coiled in the shade of the surrounding rocks. The presence of predators made his cattle nervous during their visits to the spring, and Thomas always carried his rifle during these expeditions, knowing that a single mountain lion could kill a calf and seriously injure an adult cow. The isolation of the spring location had always made Thomas uneasy. The 8-mile journey from his ranch took him through terrain that offered perfect concealment for anyone who wished to remain hidden. Rocky outcroppings, deep arroyos, and dense patches of desert vegetation could hide an entire war party, and Thomas would never know of their presence until too late. He had developed the habit of varying his route to the spring, never taking the same path twice in succession, and always watching for signs of human activity. These precautions reflected the reality of life in Apache territory during the 1880s. Every white settler lived with the knowledge that their next trip away from home might be their last. Families developed elaborate codes and signals to communicate across distances, and neighbors checked on each other with religious regularity. The absence of a smoke signal or the failure to complete a scheduled visit could trigger search parties and military intervention. Thomas had witnessed the aftermath of Apache raids on 3 separate occasions, images that haunted his sleep and informed his constant vigilance. The first had been a freight wagon found burned out along the main road to Tucson, its cargo scattered and its driver's body mutilated beyond recognition. The second had been a homestead family discovered by a cavalry patrol, their cabin reduced to ash, and their bodies left as a warning to other settlers. The third had been a mining camp where 12 men had been killed in their sleep, their equipment destroyed, and their claims abandoned forever. Each of these incidents had followed a similar pattern. The Apache had struck without warning, overwhelming their victims through superior knowledge of the terrain and tactical surprise. They took what they needed and destroyed what they could not use, sending a clear message that white intrusion into their traditional lands would be met with violent resistance. The territorial authorities responded with increased military patrols and higher bounties, but these measures seemed to have little effect on the frequency or intensity of Apache attacks. The psychological impact of living under constant threat affected every aspect of daily life. Thomas slept with his weapons within reach and kept his horses saddled and ready for immediate flight. He had practiced escape routes from his ranch house and cached supplies of various points along the trails to town. The vegetable garden behind his house had been planted in a location that offered clear sight lines in all directions, and the chicken coop had been reinforced with heavy timber and positioned to provide early warning of approaching threats. Despite these precautions, Thomas knew that survival often depended more on luck than preparation. The Apache could appear and disappear without warning, moving through familiar territory with skills honed by generations of warfare. They understood the rhythms of desert life in ways that no newcomer could hope to match, and they used this knowledge to devastating effect against settlers who remained strangers in a strange land. The morning sun climbed higher as Thomas completed his inspection of the cattle, finding all 50 head present and accounted for despite his constant fears. The animals seemed nervous, clustering together more tightly than usual and startling at sounds that normally would not attract their attention. Thomas attributed their behavior to the increasing heat, but a nagging unease suggested that something else might be affecting their mood. The walk back to the ranch house took Thomas through terrain he had traversed thousands of times, yet he remained alert to any changes in the familiar landscape. A displaced rock, an unusual pattern in the dust, or the absence of expected wildlife could indicate the presence of unwelcome visitors. This constant vigilance had become second nature during his years in the territory, a survival skill as necessary as knowing how to repair fencing or treat sick cattle. As Thomas approached his ranch house, the full weight of his situation pressed down upon him like the desert heat itself. The mortgage payment that would arrive within the month exceeded his ability to pay, and the bank had already made its position clear during his last visit to town. The cattle market remained depressed due to the ongoing Apache troubles, and even if he could get his remaining animals to market, the proceeds would fall far short of his obligations. The prospect of losing the ranch filled Thomas with a complex mixture of relief and despair. Relief because the constant struggle to survive in this harsh environment had worn him down to the point of exhaustion, and despair because failure meant abandoning the dream that had brought him west and the grave where Sarah lay buried. Starting over at his age seemed impossible, yet staying and fighting a losing battle appeared equally futile. Thomas climbed the steps to his porch and settled into the wooden chair where he spent most evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains and trying to make sense of his circumstances. The chair had been Sarah's favorite spot during their brief time together, and sitting there always brought back memories of their conversations about the future they had planned to build in this unforgiving land. Those dreams seemed impossibly naive now, casualties of harsh reality and the brutal mathematics of frontier economics. The isolation that had once seemed peaceful now felt oppressive, a reminder of how completely alone he had become in his struggle against circumstances beyond his control. The nearest town offered little in the way of community or support, its residents too focused on their own survival to provide much assistance to a failing rancher. Thomas had learned to rely entirely on his own resources, a lesson in self-sufficiency that came at the cost of human connection and shared purpose. As the morning progressed toward noon, Thomas noticed dust clouds on the horizon that usually indicated the approach of riders. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but the distance made identification impossible, and false alarms had taught him the importance of careful observation before taking action. The dust clouds seemed to be moving slowly, suggesting either a small group of riders or possibly just wind patterns stirring up the desert floor. The sight of potential visitors always created mixed emotions for Thomas. Human contact offered relief from the crushing isolation of ranch life, but every visitor also represented potential danger in a territory where friend and foe could be distinguished only at close range. Thomas had developed the habit of preparing for both possibilities whenever riders appeared on his land, positioning himself to offer hospitality to friends while remaining ready to defend against enemies. The approaching dust clouds continued to grow larger and more defined as they moved across the desert floor toward his ranch. Thomas could begin to make out individual figures within the dust, though their identity remained unclear at this distance. The pace of their approach suggested neither the urgency of a cavalry patrol nor the stealth of a raiding party, creating an uncertainty that kept Thomas alert but not immediately alarmed. Whatever the identity of his approaching visitors, Thomas knew that the next few hours would likely determine the direction of his remaining time in the Arizona Territory. Whether they brought opportunity or threat, news from the outside world, or demands he could not meet, their arrival would mark another turning point in his long struggle to survive in this harsh and unforgiving land. The dust clouds resolved themselves into 3 riders moving with the deliberate pace of men who knew exactly where they were going. Thomas squinted against the morning glare, trying to make out details that would reveal their identity and intentions. The figures appeared larger than typical cavalry soldiers, and their riding style seemed different from the military precision he had grown accustomed to seeing during army patrols. Something about their silhouettes against the desert landscape triggered an instinctive alarm that made Thomas reach for his Winchester. As the riders drew closer, Thomas could see that they wore no uniforms and carried themselves with the fluid grace of men born to the saddle. Their horses moved across the rough terrain without the stumbling gait of grain-fed cavalry mounts, picking their way through rocky patches and desert scrub with the sure-footed confidence of animals raised in this harsh environment. These were not soldiers, and they were definitely not settlers heading west with dreams of easy fortune. The realization hit Thomas like a physical blow when the lead rider came close enough for clear identification. The man's long black hair, dark skin, and traditional clothing marked him unmistakably as Apache. Thomas had never seen an Apache warrior this close to his ranch, had never expected to encounter one under circumstances that allowed for careful observation rather than desperate flight. The warrior sat his horse with casual confidence, showing no signs of haste or aggression, yet his mere presence represented everything that Thomas had been taught to fear. The 2 other riders followed several yards behind their leader, maintaining a loose formation that suggested military discipline without the rigid structure of white cavalry units. All 3 men appeared to be armed with rifles, though their weapons remained slung across their backs rather than held ready for immediate use. Their horses showed signs of hard travel, with sweat marks and dust coating their flanks, indicating that they had covered considerable distance to reach this remote location. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he considered his options. The smart choice would be to retreat into his ranch house, where he could defend himself from behind solid walls and force any attackers to come at him through narrow doorways. But something about the Apache riders' behavior suggested that they had not come for a fight. Their approach remained slow and deliberate, with no attempt at concealment or tactical positioning. They rode directly toward the ranch house with the confidence of men who expected to be received rather than repelled. The lead Apache rider raised his right hand in what Thomas recognized as a universal gesture of peaceful intentions. This simple movement carried enormous significance in a territory where the default assumption between Apache and white settlers involved immediate violence. Thomas had heard stories of similar gestures being used to lure victims into vulnerable positions, but something in the warrior's bearing suggested genuine peaceful intent rather than tactical deception. Despite his terror, Thomas found himself fascinated by his first close look at the legendary Apache fighters who had dominated territorial conversations for so many years. The lead rider appeared to be in his 30s, with the lean build and weathered features of a man who had spent his life in harsh conditions. His clothing combined traditional Apache elements with practical adaptations, including white man's boots and a hat that provided better sun protection than traditional headgear. A large knife hung at his side, and Thomas could see the stock of what appeared to be a modern rifle protruding from a leather scabbard. The warrior's horse was unlike any animal Thomas had seen during his years in the territory. Small, but powerfully built, it moved with the efficiency of a creature perfectly adapted to desert conditions. The horse's ribs showed clearly through its hide, indicating hard living and limited grazing, yet its eyes remained bright and alert. This was clearly a working animal rather than a showpiece, bred for endurance and survival rather than appearance. As the Apache riders approached within 50 yards of the ranch house, Thomas could see that they appeared to be suffering from extreme thirst. Their lips looked cracked and swollen, and they moved with the careful deliberation of men conserving their strength. The horses' heads hung low, and their breathing seemed labored despite the relatively cool morning temperature. These were not raiders at the peak of their strength, but desperate men and animals pushed to the limits of endurance. The lead Apache called out something in his native language, a string of words that Thomas could not understand, but that carried an obvious tone of request rather than demand. When Thomas failed to respond, the warrior tried again in heavily accented English, his voice hoarse with thirst and exhaustion. The words that reached Thomas across the desert air changed everything he thought he knew about the situation unfolding before his ranch house. Water, the Apache said, the single word carrying a weight of desperate need that transcended language barriers and cultural differences. Please, water for horses, for men. The simple request struck Thomas with unexpected force. In the harsh arithmetic of desert survival, water represented the difference between life and death, a resource more precious than gold or silver. Every settler in the territory understood this fundamental truth, and the unwritten laws of the frontier demanded that water be shared with anyone in genuine need. Even the bitter enemies could be expected to honor requests for water, though such requests rarely arose between Apache and white settlers. Thomas found himself facing a decision that would define not just the next few minutes, but potentially the rest of his life. Every instinct developed during years of frontier existence screamed warnings about the dangers of showing mercy to Apache warriors. He had heard countless stories of settlers who had offered assistance to seemingly peaceful Indians only to be killed for their kindness. The territorial newspapers regularly published accounts of such incidents, using them to justify the most extreme measures against all Apache people. Yet the evidence before his eyes suggested that these three men posed no immediate threat to his safety. Their weapons remained holstered, their posture indicated exhaustion rather than aggression, and their request for water aligned with the most basic principles of human decency. Thomas had survived 5 years in Apache territory by trusting his instincts, and those instincts now told him that these warriors had come seeking survival rather than violence. The lead Apache repeated his request, adding words that Thomas could barely make out, but that seemed to express genuine desperation. The warriors' companions remained silent, but their condition appeared even worse than their leaders. One of them swayed slightly in his saddle, and Thomas could see that his lips were bleeding from severe dehydration. These men were clearly at the end of their resources, driven to seek help from their traditional enemies by circumstances that left them no other choice. Thomas made his decision with the sudden clarity that sometimes accompanies moments of profound moral choice. Setting down his rifle where the Apache could see his action, he walked slowly toward the well at the center of his ranch yard. The wooden bucket that hung from the well's rope had provided water for his family and livestock for 5 years, and now would serve men who represented everything he had been taught to fear and hate. The Apache warriors watched Thomas's movements with intense attention, their hands remaining well away from their weapons despite their obvious vulnerability. The lead warrior spoke quietly to his companions in their native language, words that Thomas assumed conveyed instructions about how to respond to this unexpected development. The tone remained calm and controlled, suggesting that these men possessed the discipline to maintain peaceful behavior even in their desperate condition. Drawing water from the well required more effort than usual, as the drought had lowered the water table significantly during the past month. Thomas could hear the Apache horses moving restlessly, sensing the proximity of water and eager to drink. The bucket felt heavier than normal as Thomas hauled it up from the depths of the well, filled with the precious liquid that might mean the difference between life and death for his unexpected visitors. The lead Apache dismounted slowly and approached the well with careful, deliberate movements designed to demonstrate his peaceful intentions. Up close, Thomas could see that the warrior was younger than he had initially appeared, probably in his mid-20s rather than 30s. His face bore the kind of weathered intensity that came from years of hard living, but his eyes showed intelligence and what appeared to be genuine gratitude. Without speaking, Thomas offered the bucket to the Apache warrior, who accepted it with a slight nod that seemed to carry enormous significance. The warrior drank deeply, but not greedily, showing the kind of discipline that Thomas associated with experienced desert travelers. After satisfying his most immediate needs, the warrior passed the bucket to his companions, who drank in the same controlled manner despite their obvious desperation. The horses proved more difficult to satisfy than their riders. Thomas had to draw several more buckets from the well to provide adequate water for the 3 animals, each of which drank with the desperate intensity of creatures that had been pushed beyond their normal limits. The Apache warriors helped with this process, working alongside Thomas with an efficiency that suggested considerable experience in caring for horses under difficult conditions. During this period of shared labor, Thomas found himself studying his unlikely guests with growing fascination. These were the legendary Apache warriors whose mere presence had terrorized the territory for decades. Yet up close they seemed like ordinary men dealing with the same survival challenges that faced every desert dweller. Their clothing was practical rather than savage, their behavior disciplined rather than wild, and their gratitude for his assistance appeared genuine rather than calculated. The lead warrior attempted to communicate with Thomas through a combination of broken English and hand gestures, apparently trying to explain how they had come to be in such desperate condition. Thomas gathered that their usual water sources had failed them, forcing them to travel much farther than anticipated to find relief. The warrior gestured toward the mountains to the east, suggesting that they had been moving for days without adequate water for themselves or their animals. As the immediate crisis of thirst was addressed, Thomas began to consider the larger implications of his situation. He was now harboring 3 Apache warriors on his property, providing them with assistance that could easily be interpreted as collaboration with the enemy. If word of this incident reached the territorial authorities or his neighbors, he could face serious legal consequences or vigilante justice. The unofficial policy toward anyone suspected of aiding Apache raiders was swift and brutal. Yet the alternative to offering assistance would have been to watch 3 men and their animals die of thirst within sight of adequate water, a choice that violated every principle Thomas had been raised to respect. His parents had taught him that basic human decency transcended political differences, and his years of frontier hardship had only strengthened this conviction. Whatever these men might have done in the past, they deserved water when they asked for it in genuine need. The Apache warriors seemed to understand the risks that Thomas was taking on their behalf. They worked quickly and efficiently to water their horses, clearly intending to minimize the time they spent on his property. The lead warrior made several attempts to communicate what appeared to be expressions of gratitude, using gestures and the few English words he commanded to convey sentiments that transcended language barriers. As the watering process neared completion, Thomas found himself wondering about the larger circumstances that had brought these men to his ranch. The Apache were known for their intimate knowledge of desert water sources, and their arrival at his remote location suggested that other options had been exhausted. This implied a level of desperation that went beyond temporary inconvenience to suggest a more fundamental crisis in their situation. The territorial newspapers had reported increased military pressure on Apache groups throughout the region, with cavalry patrols operating from multiple bases to deny the warriors access to their traditional water sources and hunting grounds. If these reports were accurate, Thomas might be witnessing the human cost of a military strategy designed to force Apache surrender through systematic deprivation of basic necessities. The moral complexity of this situation weighed heavily on Thomas as he watched the warriors prepare to continue their journey. These men were undoubtedly capable of violence, and they might well have participated in raids that had claimed the lives of innocent settlers. Yet they were also human beings facing the fundamental challenge of survival in a harsh environment, driven by the same basic needs that motivated every person who tried to make a life in the desert. The lead Apache warrior approached Thomas as his companions finished preparing their horses for travel. Speaking slowly and carefully in his limited English, the warrior attempted to express his gratitude for the assistance they had received. The words were simple, but the sincerity behind them seemed unmistakable. This man understood that Thomas could have chosen differently, and that choice had potentially saved their lives. The warrior reached into a leather pouch and withdrew what appeared to be a small piece of worked silver, clearly intended as payment for the water they had consumed. Thomas waved away the offered payment, partly from instinct and partly from a recognition that accepting compensation would transform a humanitarian gesture into a commercial transaction. The warrior seemed puzzled by this refusal, but replaced the silver in his pouch without argument. As the three Apache warriors mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Thomas felt a strange mixture of relief and regret. Relief that the encounter had concluded without violence, and that his risky decision to offer assistance had not resulted in betrayal or attack. Regret because this brief interaction had humanized men he had been conditioned to see as savage enemies, complicating his understanding of the conflict that dominated territorial life. The lead warrior spoke one final time before departing, his words carrying a solemnity that suggested they held special significance. Though Thomas could not understand the Apache language, the tone and manner of delivery seemed to indicate some form of formal promise or commitment. The warrior then turned his horse toward the east and began riding away from the ranch, followed by his two companions. Thomas watched the three riders disappear into the desert landscape, their forms gradually merging with the heat shimmer that rose from the sun-baked earth. Within minutes, they had vanished as completely as if they had never existed, leaving only the trampled ground around the well and the lingering memory of an encounter that challenged every assumption Thomas had held about his Apache neighbors. The implications of what had just occurred would not become clear for some time, but Thomas could already sense that his simple decision to share water with thirsty strangers had set in motion events that would extend far beyond his remote ranch. In a territory where hatred between Apache and white settlers seemed as natural as the desert heat, his act of basic human kindness had created a small crack in the wall of mutual hostility that defined frontier relations. As Thomas returned to his normal morning routine, he found it difficult to focus on the mundane tasks that typically filled his days. The image of the grateful Apache warrior lingered in his mind, along with questions about the circumstances that had driven these men to seek help from their traditional enemies. The encounter had lasted less than an hour, but its effects would ripple through Thomas's life in ways he could not yet imagine. The sun continued its relentless climb toward its noon peak, and the desert heat began to shimmer off the rocky landscape surrounding the ranch. Thomas completed his daily inspection of the property with mechanical efficiency, his thoughts still occupied by the morning's extraordinary events. He had made a choice that could easily have cost him his life, yet he felt no regret about offering water to men who clearly needed it more than they needed to perpetuate ancient hatreds. In the distance, dust devils danced across the desert floor, temporary formations that appeared and disappeared according to laws that Thomas did not fully understand. The sight reminded him of his brief visitors, men who had materialized from the vastness of the territory and vanished just as quickly, leaving only questions and the memory of unexpected human connection across the divide of cultural enmity. 3 days passed before Thomas fully comprehended that his encounter with the Apache warriors had marked the beginning of something unprecedented rather than an isolated incident. The first sign appeared as subtle changes in the behavior of wildlife around his ranch. Rabbits that normally fled at the first sign of human presence now lingered near his vegetable garden, showing an unusual lack of fear. Birds that had always avoided the immediate vicinity of his ranch house began nesting in the nearby mesquite bushes, creating a level of animal activity that Thomas had never observed before. More significantly, Thomas noticed that his cattle had begun grazing in areas they had previously avoided, venturing closer to the rocky outcroppings and dense brush where predators typically concealed themselves. The animals seemed calmer and more confident, as if some invisible threat had been removed from their environment. Thomas initially attributed these changes to seasonal variations or his own imagination, but the patterns persisted and became more pronounced with each passing day. The fourth morning brought concrete evidence that the Apache warrior's visit had indeed altered the dynamics of his isolated existence. Thomas discovered a freshly killed rabbit hanging from a post near his corral, cleaned and prepared for cooking. No note or message accompanied this gift, but the method of preparation showed clear signs of Apache hunting techniques. Someone had wanted Thomas to know that his kindness had been remembered and that it would be repaid. Thomas examined the offering with mixed emotions. The rabbit represented food he desperately needed, as his supplies had dwindled to the point where every meal required careful rationing. Yet accepting this gift also represented a form of communication with people he was supposed to consider deadly enemies. The territorial authorities would certainly view such contact as collaboration, regardless of the humanitarian circumstances that had initiated it. Despite these concerns, Thomas prepared and ate the rabbit, finding it more flavorful than any meat he had tasted in months. The protein provided energy he had been lacking, and the knowledge that someone cared enough about his welfare to provide food created an unexpected sense of connection to the larger world. For the first time in months, Thomas felt as though he was not completely alone in his struggle to survive in the harsh desert environment. Over the following weeks, similar gifts appeared with irregular frequency around Thomas's ranch. Sometimes he would find wild plants that he had never seen before, varieties that proved both nutritious and medicinal when he experimented with preparing them. Other times, he discovered that repairs had been made to his fencing or that stones had been cleared from paths where his cattle regularly traveled. Never did he see the individuals responsible for these acts of assistance, but their Apache origin seemed unmistakable. The invisible presence of his new allies became a source of both comfort and concern for Thomas. Comfort because he knew that eyes were watching over his property, providing a level of protection that no lone rancher could achieve through his own efforts. Concern because he remained uncertain about the motivations behind this assistance, and worried about the potential consequences if the relationship were discovered by hostile parties. Thomas's monthly trip to Willow Creek for supplies provided a stark reminder of how dramatically his situation had changed. The town remained gripped by fear of Apache raids, with residents organizing armed patrols and discussing increasingly extreme measures for dealing with the perceived threat. The general store owner, Henderson, had installed additional defenses around his business, and conversations inevitably turned to stories of recent attacks and rumors of increased Apache activity in the region. During this visit, Thomas learned that several ranchers in neighboring valleys had reported unusual encounters with Apache groups. Unlike the typical raids that characterized Apache settler interactions, these encounters had involved peaceful requests for water or food, followed by mysterious gifts left at ranch sites. The territorial authorities dismissed these reports as propaganda designed to make the Apache appear more civilized than their actions warranted, but Thomas recognized the pattern from his own experience. The newspaper from Tucson carried accounts of increased military pressure on Apache groups, with cavalry units operating continuously to deny the warriors access to traditional water sources and hunting grounds. General Miles, the military commander responsible for Apache affairs, had publicly stated his intention to force unconditional surrender through systematic deprivation of resources. The strategy appeared to be working, as reports indicated that several Apache bands had already surrendered to authorities at various military installations. Yet Thomas's personal experience suggested a more complex reality than the official accounts conveyed. The Apache warriors who had visited his ranch had displayed no signs of demoralization or defeat, despite their obvious distress from thirst and travel. Their behavior had shown discipline and intelligence rather than the desperate savagery that newspaper accounts typically described. If these men represented a defeated enemy, they were conducting themselves with remarkable dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. The moral implications of his ongoing relationship with unknown Apache benefactors weighed heavily on Thomas's conscience. Every gift he accepted, every benefit he derived from their invisible protection, potentially made him complicit in activities that his own government considered treasonous. Yet the alternative seemed to involve rejecting assistance that might mean the difference between survival and failure in his desperate situation. Thomas attempted to rationalize his position by focusing on the humanitarian nature of his initial gesture. Providing water to thirsty travelers represented basic human decency rather than political collaboration, and any subsequent relationship had developed naturally from that foundation. The Apache warriors had chosen to express their gratitude through assistance rather than violence, demonstrating a level of moral sophistication that contradicted prevailing stereotypes about their character and motivations. The practical benefits of his new situation became increasingly apparent as summer progressed toward its brutal peak. Thomas's cattle continued to thrive despite conditions that had devastated other herds in the region, apparently benefiting from protection against predators that he could not provide alone. His water consumption seemed to stretch further than expected, possibly because unknown hands were making repairs to his irrigation system that prevented waste. Most importantly, the psychological burden of complete isolation had been lifted by the knowledge that others cared about his welfare. Thomas began to modify his own behavior in response to these changed circumstances. He left portions of his meals exposed where they could be easily taken by anyone who needed food, and he made sure that his well remained accessible to travelers who might require water during his absences from the ranch. These gestures represented his attempt to reciprocate the kindness he had received while maintaining the plausible deniability that might protect him from accusations of collaboration. The relationship that had developed between Thomas and his invisible benefactors operated according to unspoken rules that both sides seemed to understand intuitively. Direct contact remained rare and brief, but communication occurred through the language of mutual assistance and respect. Thomas provided water and implied permission to take food when needed, while his Apache neighbors provided protection and practical assistance that enabled his survival in an increasingly hostile environment. This arrangement might have continued indefinitely if not for events beyond the immediate vicinity of Thomas's ranch. Reports reaching Willow Creek indicated that General Miles had intensified his campaign against the remaining Apache groups, deploying additional cavalry units and establishing new supply bases throughout the territory. The pressure on Apache warriors had become so severe that surrender appeared to be their only remaining option for survival. Thomas learned the details of this campaign during his next visit to town, where conversations focused entirely on the military situation and its implications for civilian settlers. Henderson, the store owner, expressed cautious optimism that the Apache threat would soon be eliminated entirely, allowing normal economic development to resume throughout the territory. Other residents shared this hope, while remaining skeptical about the military's ability to complete their mission effectively. The newspaper accounts that Thomas read in town painted a picture of systematic destruction of Apache resistance. Cavalry units had located and destroyed numerous Apache camps, capturing supplies and forcing the warriors to abandon traditional strongholds. Several prominent war leaders had already surrendered with their followers, and intelligence reports suggested that even Geronimo was considering negotiation with military authorities. Yet despite these apparent successes, Apache raids continued to occur throughout the territory, suggesting that significant resistance remained active. The raids had taken on a different character, focusing on acquiring supplies and avoiding contact with military units rather than inflicting maximum damage on civilian targets. This shift in tactics indicated adaptation rather than defeat, as the Apache warriors modified their strategy to cope with changed circumstances. Thomas found himself caught between competing loyalties as the military campaign reached its climax. His gratitude for Apache assistance conflicted with his identity as an American citizen who was supposed to support his government's policies. The warriors who had helped him might well be the same men that cavalry units were trying to capture or kill, and his continued acceptance of their assistance might be undermining the war effort that promised to bring peace to the territory. The resolution of this conflict came sooner than Thomas expected, in the form of a visit that would test every assumption he had developed about his unusual relationship with his Apache neighbors. On a morning when the heat already shimmered off the desert floor despite the early hour, Thomas observed a dust cloud approaching his ranch that was larger than any he had seen since the Apache warriors' first visit weeks earlier. This time, however, the riders approached from multiple directions, suggesting a coordinated movement rather than a chance encounter. Thomas counted at least a dozen horses as the riders drew near enough for identification, far more than had ever visited his ranch simultaneously. The group included several of the warriors he recognized from previous encounters, but most were strangers whose presence indicated that word of his assistance had spread throughout the Apache community. The lead rider carried what appeared to be a white cloth, the universal symbol of peaceful intentions, yet the size of the group suggested that this visit would involve more than simple requests for water. As the Apache delegation approached within hailing distance, Thomas could see that they had brought their own water supplies, suggesting that their visit served purposes beyond meeting immediate survival needs. Several of the warriors carried items that appeared to be gifts or trade goods, indicating that they intended to formalize the relationship that had developed through mutual assistance over the preceding weeks. This was not a desperate request for emergency aid, but a diplomatic mission designed to establish a more permanent arrangement. The lead warrior, whom Thomas now recognized as the same man who had first requested water, dismounted and approached the ranch house with the same careful dignity he had displayed during their initial encounter. This time, however, he was accompanied by an older man whose bearing and regalia marked him as a person of considerable authority within Apache society. The older man's presence transformed what might have been a simple gesture of gratitude into an official delegation with significant political implications. Thomas realized that he was about to participate in a negotiation that would determine not just his own fate, but potentially influence the course of the broader conflict between Apache and American forces. His simple gesture of providing water to thirsty travelers had evolved into something far more complex and consequential than he had ever imagined possible. The decision he had made to treat desperate men as human beings rather than enemies was about to be tested by circumstances that would require him to choose between loyalty to his government and fidelity to principles of basic human decency. The Apache delegation arranged themselves in a formal pattern that suggested significant ceremonial content to their visit. Thomas had no experience with Native American diplomatic protocols, but he recognized that he was expected to participate in proceedings that followed rules he did not understand. His response to their arrival would determine whether the relationship that had sustained him through the summer's hardships could survive the transition from informal mutual assistance to formal diplomatic contact. The older Apache leader began speaking in his native language, his words carrying the formal cadence of ceremonial address. Though Thomas could not understand the specific content, the tone suggested respect and serious purpose rather than demands or threats. The lead warrior who had first visited his ranch served as translator, rendering the older man's words in a broken but understandable English that revealed the extraordinary nature of the proposal they had come to present. Thomas found himself listening to an offer that challenged every assumption about the relationship between Apache and American settlers in the Arizona Territory. The delegation had not come to request additional assistance or to formalize existing arrangements, but to propose something unprecedented in the history of conflict between their peoples. The older Apache leader was offering Thomas protection and support in exchange for his continued neutrality in the escalating military campaign that threatened to destroy the remaining independent Apache groups. The implications of this proposal struck Thomas with overwhelming force. He was being asked to choose sides in a conflict that had already claimed thousands of lives and showed no signs of reaching a peaceful resolution. Accepting the Apache offer would make him an active participant in resistance to American military policy, while rejecting it might cost him the assistance that had enabled his survival and possibly expose him to retaliation from men who knew every detail of his vulnerable situation. Yet beneath the political complexity lay a simpler human reality. The men standing before him had shown him kindness when he expected hostility, had provided assistance when he faced failure, and had treated him with respect when they could easily have viewed him as an enemy. Their offer represented not just a political alliance, but an invitation to participate in a relationship based on mutual recognition of shared humanity rather than ethnic or cultural divisions. Thomas realized that his response would define not just his immediate future, but his understanding of what it meant to be human in a world torn by hatred and violence. The choice between loyalty to abstract political principles and fidelity to concrete human relationships would determine whether his remaining time in the Arizona Territory would be spent as an agent of reconciliation or as another casualty of a conflict that seemed to consume everything it touched. The weight of decision pressed down upon Thomas like the desert sun at its merciless peak. Standing before the Apache delegation, he understood that his choice would ripple far beyond the boundaries of his failing ranch to influence the course of a conflict that had already shaped the destiny of an entire territory. The older Apache leader waited with patient dignity for his response, while the younger warriors maintained their positions in a formation that suggested both respect and readiness for any eventuality. Thomas found himself studying the faces of the men who had made this unprecedented offer. These were not the savage raiders of newspaper accounts, but individuals whose expressions revealed intelligence, hope, and a weariness that came from years of fighting an increasingly hopeless war. The older leader bore scars that spoke of countless battles, yet his eyes held a vision of something beyond endless violence. The younger warriors showed similar signs of hard experience, tempered by what appeared to be genuine respect for the man whose simple act of kindness had brought them to this moment. The formal nature of the delegation indicated that Thomas's decision carried implications far beyond his personal relationship with these particular warriors. Word of his assistance had clearly spread throughout the Apache community, transforming him from an isolated rancher into a symbol of the possibility that white settlers and Apache people could coexist peacefully. His choice to accept or reject their offer would signal to both communities whether such coexistence remained possible or whether the conflict must continue until one side achieved total victory. Thomas considered the practical aspects of his situation as he weighed the Apache proposal. His ranch remained on the verge of financial collapse, with mortgage payments he could not meet and cattle that barely provided subsistence income. The assistance he had received from his Apache neighbors had kept him alive through the summer, but winter would bring new challenges that might exceed even their ability to provide effective help. Accepting their formal alliance might offer the support necessary for long-term survival, while rejection could lead to renewed isolation and inevitable failure. Yet the political risks of accepting the Apache offer could hardly be overstated. The territorial authorities had made their position clear regarding any form of cooperation with hostile Indian groups, and the military campaign against the Apache had reached a level of intensity that left little room for neutral positions. Discovery of his alliance with Apache warriors would result in charges of treason, prosecution in territorial courts, and possible execution if authorities chose to make an example of his case. More troubling still was the moral complexity of aligning himself with men who, despite their kindness to him personally, remained participants in a guerrilla war that had claimed the lives of innocent settlers throughout the territory. The Apache warriors standing before him might have been responsible for raids that had left families dead and homesteads burned, actions that justified the military campaign designed to force their surrender. Thomas had to reconcile his gratitude for their assistance with the knowledge that accepting their alliance might contribute to future violence against people who shared his own cultural background. The older Apache leader seemed to sense Thomas's internal struggle and began speaking again, his words carrying a tone of explanation rather than persuasion. The younger warrior who served as translator conveyed the essence of the older man's message, revealing details about Apache perspectives on the conflict that challenged many of Thomas's assumptions about the nature of the war in which he had become an unwilling participant. The Apache leader explained that his people had not chosen war, but had been forced into conflict by the systematic destruction of their traditional way of life. White settlers had occupied lands that Apache groups had used for hunting and gathering for generations, while military forces had driven them from water sources essential for survival. The raids that terrorized territorial settlements represented desperate attempts to obtain resources necessary for basic survival rather than gratuitous violence motivated by hatred of white people. This explanation did not excuse the deaths of innocent settlers, but it provided context that complicated the simple narrative of savage aggression that dominated territorial discourse. The Apache warriors were fighting for the survival of their families and communities, using methods that often resulted in tragedy for all parties involved. Their offer to Thomas represented an attempt to find alternatives to violence, ways of coexisting that might reduce the suffering experienced by both Apache and American communities. The translated words of the Apache leader revealed that Thomas's gesture of providing water had carried symbolic significance far beyond its immediate humanitarian value. In Apache culture, the sharing of water represented one of the most sacred forms of hospitality, creating bonds of mutual obligation that transcended political differences. Thomas's willingness to provide water to desperate enemies had demonstrated that some white settlers could recognize Apache humanity despite the hatred that characterized relations between their peoples. More importantly, the continued assistance that Thomas had accepted from Apache hands had proven that cooperation between the communities remained possible under the right circumstances. The older leader suggested that Thomas's ranch could serve as a model for the kind of relationship that might eventually end the cycle of violence that had consumed the territory for decades. His acceptance of their formal alliance would signal to both communities that alternatives to endless warfare deserved serious consideration. The Apache proposal included specific provisions designed to protect Thomas from retaliation while maximizing the benefits of their cooperation. The warriors would continue to provide invisible assistance with his cattle and property maintenance, but they would also establish communication systems that could warn him of approaching military patrols or hostile Apache groups that might not share their commitment to peaceful coexistence. In return, Thomas would maintain his well as a reliable water source for Apache travelers and provide early warning of military activities that threatened Apache positions in the region. Thomas understood that accepting this arrangement would make him an intelligence asset for Apache resistance forces, a role that went far beyond simple humanitarian assistance to constitute active participation in the conflict. Yet the alternative might involve watching his Apache allies suffer defeat and possible extermination while he remained a passive observer to tragedy that his intervention might help prevent. The choice between active collaboration and passive complicity carried moral implications that extended far beyond his personal survival. The discussion continued through the morning as Thomas asked questions designed to clarify the terms and implications of the Apache proposal. He learned that similar arrangements have been established with several other isolated ranchers, creating a network of covert cooperation that provided Apache groups with essential resources while offering settlers protection and assistance that their own government could not provide. The network operated according to principles of mutual benefit rather than political ideology, driven by practical necessity rather than abstract principles. Thomas also discovered that the Apache alliance included provisions for his personal safety that went beyond simple protection from raids or attacks. If his cooperation with Apache groups were discovered by territorial authorities, the warriors would provide him with safe passage to Mexico or other locations where he could avoid prosecution. This offered him an escape route from the consequences of his choice, while ensuring that his decision to help Apache resistance would not result in his death or imprisonment. The scope and sophistication of the Apache proposal impressed Thomas with its recognition of both the benefits and risks inherent in their cooperation. These men had clearly thought through the implications of their offer with care, developing strategies that maximize the advantages while minimizing the dangers for all parties involved. Their approach reflected the kind of strategic thinking that had enabled Apache groups to resist American expansion for decades despite overwhelming disadvantages in numbers and resources. As the sun climbed toward its noon peak and the desert heat began to build toward its daily crescendo, Thomas found himself approaching a decision that would define the remainder of his time in Arizona territory. The moral arguments seemed evenly balanced, with compelling reasons for both accepting and rejecting the Apache offer. His choice would ultimately depend on his assessment of which course of action offered the greatest possibility for reducing suffering and promoting human dignity in the face of seemingly irreconcilable conflict. The practical considerations also presented complex trade-offs that defied simple analysis. Accepting the Apache alliance would provide him with resources and protection essential for survival, but it would also expose him to risks that could result in the loss of everything he had worked to build. Rejecting their offer would maintain his legal standing as a loyal American citizen, but it might also condemn him to renewed isolation and eventual failure in his struggle to maintain the ranch where Sarah lay buried. Thomas realized that his decision could not be based entirely on calculations of personal advantage or abstract moral principles. The men standing before him had shown him kindness when they could have chosen violence, had treated him with respect when they could have viewed him as an enemy, and had offered him partnership when they could have simply taken what they needed by force. Their behavior had demonstrated that human decency could transcend cultural differences and political conflicts when individuals chose to recognize their shared humanity. The older Apache leader spoke once more, his words conveying a sense of urgency that suggested their delegation could not remain in the open much longer without risking discovery by military patrols. The younger warrior's translation emphasized that Thomas's decision needed to be made immediately, as the opportunity for formal alliance might not present itself again if current military pressures forced Apache groups to abandon their attempts at peaceful coexistence. Thomas took a final look around his ranch, seeing it with new eyes that recognized both its limitations and its potential. The failing cattle operation that had consumed his savings and claimed his wife's life could become something more than a personal tragedy if his choice helped demonstrate that cooperation between hostile communities remained possible. His isolated homestead could serve as proof that human decency transcended political boundaries when individuals chose compassion over hatred. The decision that had seemed so complex and morally ambiguous suddenly crystallized into clarity as Thomas recognized the fundamental choice he faced. He could continue to participate in a system that defined Apache people as enemies to be destroyed, or he could choose to treat them as human beings deserving of the same dignity and respect he claimed for himself. The specific political and legal implications of his choice mattered less than its affirmation of principles that gave meaning to human existence. Thomas stepped forward and extended his hand toward the older Apache leader, offering the traditional gesture of agreement that transcended cultural differences. The older man accepted his hand with a grip that conveyed both strength and gentleness, sealing an alliance that would transform Thomas's understanding of his place in the conflict that had shaped territorial history. The younger warriors smiled with obvious relief and satisfaction, indicating that they had hoped for this outcome despite the risks it entailed for all parties involved. The formal ceremony that followed drew upon traditions from both cultures, creating a hybrid ritual that honored the significance of their agreement while acknowledging the unprecedented nature of their cooperation. Thomas found himself participating in observances that he did not fully understand, but that clearly carried deep meaning for his Apache allies. The blending of different customs seemed appropriate for an alliance that sought to bridge differences that had previously appeared irreconcilable. As the Apache delegation prepared to depart, the older leader spoke words that required no translation to convey their significance. His tone expressed gratitude for Thomas's decision while acknowledging the courage required to choose cooperation over conformity to prevailing attitudes. The younger warriors made gestures of respect that indicated they understood the risks Thomas had accepted on their behalf and the faith he had placed in their promises of protection and assistance. The departure of the Apache delegation left Thomas alone with the knowledge that his life had been fundamentally altered by his choice to accept their alliance. He was no longer simply a struggling rancher trying to survive in a harsh environment, but a participant in an experiment in peaceful coexistence that might offer hope for resolving conflicts that seemed destined to continue indefinitely. His decision to trust in human decency rather than political hatred had committed him to a path whose ultimate destination remained unknown, but whose direction pointed toward possibilities that transcended the limitations of current circumstances. The afternoon heat shimmered off the desert landscape as Thomas returned to his daily routine with the understanding that nothing would ever be quite the same again. His choice to ally himself with Apache warriors had made him a bridge between hostile communities, a role that carried both opportunities and dangers he could not yet fully comprehend. The simple act of providing water to thirsty strangers had evolved into a commitment to demonstrate that cooperation between enemies remained possible when individuals chose to recognize their shared humanity over their inherited hatreds. The transformation of Thomas's existence became evident within days of his formal alliance with the Apache delegation. His cattle, which had struggled to survive the harsh summer months, began thriving in ways that seemed almost miraculous to neighboring ranchers who visited his property. The animals grazed peacefully in areas that had previously been avoided due to predator threats, their behavior suggesting that invisible guardians now protected them from the mountain lions and bears that plagued other herds in the region. Thomas discovered that his water consumption had become significantly more efficient, apparently due to repairs and modifications to his irrigation system that occurred during his absence from the ranch. Channels that had previously leaked precious water into the desert floor now directed every drop toward his vegetable garden and livestock watering areas. The improvements showed signs of Apache engineering techniques, using natural materials and traditional methods that proved more effective than the conventional approaches Thomas had attempted. More remarkably, Thomas found that his isolated ranch had become a stop on an underground network that facilitated communication between scattered Apache groups throughout the territory. Messages passed through his property in forms he could not always recognize, carried by individuals who appeared and disappeared like desert spirits. Sometimes he would discover small objects arranged in patterns near his well, configurations that conveyed information to those who understood their significance, while remaining meaningless to casual observers. The intelligence that flowed through this network provided Thomas with unprecedented insight into the true state of the Apache resistance and the military campaign designed to crush it. He learned that General Miles's strategy of systematic deprivation was indeed forcing many Apache groups toward surrender, but that significant resistance remained active throughout the region. The warriors who had allied themselves with Thomas represented a faction that sought alternatives to both surrender and continued warfare, exploring possibilities for coexistence that military leaders on both sides considered impossible. Thomas's ranch became a crucial link in this network because of its location at the intersection of several traditional Apache travel routes and its proximity to water sources that remained accessible despite military efforts to deny them to hostile groups. His cooperation allowed Apache messengers to maintain communication between widely scattered bands, coordinating resistance activities and sharing information about military movements. The intelligence-gathering capabilities that this network provided proved essential for Apache survival as cavalry patrols intensified their operations throughout the territory. The sophistication of Apache intelligence operations impressed Thomas with their understanding of military tactics and strategic planning. His allies possessed detailed knowledge of cavalry patrol schedules, supply routes, and command structures that enabled them to avoid contact with superior forces while maintaining their freedom of movement. They had developed communication systems that operated effectively across vast distances, using methods that left no traces visible to pursuing soldiers. Thomas learned to participate in these intelligence activities by observing the movements of military patrols that passed near his ranch and reporting their schedules and destinations through the message system that operated from his property. This information helped Apache groups avoid encounters with cavalry units while providing advance warning of military operations that might threaten their camps or supply sources. His contributions proved valuable enough to earn him increased protection and assistance from his Apache allies. The relationship between Thomas and his Apache partners evolved from simple mutual aid to genuine friendship as he came to know individual warriors who regularly passed through his property. Many of these men spoke enough English to engage in basic conversation, sharing stories about their families, their hopes for the future, and their perspectives on the conflict that had dominated their lives for so many years. Thomas discovered that their motivations were far more complex than territorial newspapers suggested, driven by love for their children and desire to preserve their way of life rather than hatred for white settlers. One warrior in particular, a man named Nate who served as a liaison between different Apache groups, became a regular visitor to Thomas's ranch and eventually a close friend. Nate spoke excellent English, having learned the language during a period of imprisonment at a military facility, and he possessed deep understanding of both Apache and American cultures. Through their conversations, Thomas gained insight into Apache perspectives on the conflict that challenged many of his previous assumptions about the war's causes and potential solutions. Nate explained that many Apache leaders had originally hoped for peaceful coexistence with American settlers, recognizing that their traditional way of life would require adaptation to changing circumstances. However, the systematic destruction of their hunting grounds, the appropriation of their water sources, and the confinement of their people to inadequate reservations had made peaceful coexistence impossible under terms that preserved Apache dignity and survival. The current resistance represented their final attempt to negotiate acceptable conditions for surrender rather than submit to cultural extinction. These conversations revealed that the Apache warriors who had allied themselves with Thomas represented a moderate faction within the resistance, men who sought to minimize violence while maintaining pressure for negotiated settlement of the conflict. They distinguished themselves from more radical elements that favored continued warfare regardless of consequences, just as they differed from those who advocated immediate surrender regardless of terms. Their approach reflected a sophisticated understanding of political dynamics that few American observers recognized or acknowledged. Thomas's participation in this moderate faction placed him at the center of efforts to develop alternatives to the total war strategy that both sides had adopted as their official policy. His ranch served as a neutral meeting ground where representatives of different Apache groups could gather safely to discuss strategy and coordinate activities. The protection that his alliance provided extended to these gatherings, creating one of the few locations in the territory where Apache leaders could meet without fear of military interference. The most significant of these gatherings occurred in late autumn, when representatives from virtually every remaining independent Apache group converged on Thomas's ranch to debate their response to increased military pressure. Thomas found himself hosting a council that included some of the most famous war leaders in Apache history, men whose names had appeared in newspaper headlines throughout the nation. The sight of these legendary figures sitting peacefully around his modest ranch house seemed surreal, yet their presence demonstrated the crucial role his property had come to play in Apache political affairs. The council deliberations revealed deep divisions within Apache leadership regarding the best strategy for ensuring their people's survival. Some leaders advocated continued resistance regardless of cost, arguing that death in battle was preferable to slow extinction on government reservations. Others favored immediate surrender in hopes of negotiating better conditions through cooperation with military authorities. A third faction, represented by Nate and his allies, proposed a middle course that would demonstrate Apache willingness to coexist peacefully with American settlers while maintaining their right to acceptable terms for surrender. Thomas listened to these debates with fascination and growing understanding of the tragic complexity that characterized the conflict from Apache perspectives. These were not savage warriors driven by bloodlust, but thoughtful leaders wrestling with impossible choices that would determine the fate of their people for generations. Their discussions showed the same kind of strategic thinking and moral reasoning that characterized American political debates, yet their options remained severely limited by military realities that left little room for negotiation. The council ultimately decided to attempt one final initiative designed to demonstrate Apache sincerity about peaceful coexistence while establishing their credibility for future negotiations. They would identify specific American settlements and ranches that had shown willingness to treat Apache people with basic human dignity, providing these locations with protection and assistance that proved Apache capability for positive relationships with their former enemies. Thomas's ranch would serve as the model for this initiative, demonstrating that cooperation between Apache and American communities could benefit both sides. This decision transformed Thomas's property into the centerpiece of an unprecedented experiment in peaceful coexistence that attracted attention from both military authorities and territorial newspapers. Reports began circulating about a mysterious rancher whose cattle thrived despite Apache raids that devastated neighboring operations, whose property remained secure while other homesteads faced constant threat. Investigators sent to examine his situation found evidence of prosperity and security that seemed inexplicable given his isolated location and modest resources. The success of Thomas's ranch as a model of Apache-American cooperation began attracting visitors from other parts of the territory, settlers who sought to understand how he had achieved security and prosperity in the midst of ongoing warfare. Thomas found himself in the position of explaining his relationship with Apache groups without revealing the specific nature of his alliance or the identity of his partners. He developed carefully crafted explanations that emphasized humanitarian principles and mutual respect while avoiding details that might compromise his allies' security. These visitors often left Thomas's ranch with new perspectives on Apache people and the possibilities for peaceful coexistence, carrying stories back to their own communities that challenge prevailing stereotypes and assumptions. Some returned to their homes with practical knowledge about Apache customs and perspectives that helped them avoid conflicts and misunderstandings. Others became advocates for more humane policies toward Apache prisoners and refugees, arguing that cooperation offered better prospects for peace than continued warfare. The ripple effects of Thomas's alliance with Apache groups began influencing territorial politics in ways that neither he nor his partners had anticipated. Newspapers started publishing editorials that questioned the wisdom of total war policies, suggesting that negotiated settlement might achieve better results than military conquest. Some political leaders began advocating for approaches that recognized Apache humanity while addressing legitimate American concerns about security and territorial development. Yet this progress also created dangers that threatened to destroy everything that Thomas and his Apache allies had worked to achieve. Military authorities became increasingly suspicious of reports about successful cooperation between settlers and Apache groups, viewing such developments as evidence of collaboration that undermined their campaign. Intelligence officers began investigating Thomas's situation with the intention of exposing any illegal activities that might justify prosecution for treason or collaboration with hostile forces. The tension between growing success and increasing danger reached a climax when General Miles himself decided to visit Thomas's ranch to investigate reports about his unusual relationship with Apache groups. The general's reputation for ruthless efficiency in dealing with Apache resistance made his impending visit a potential death sentence for Thomas and his allies if their cooperation were discovered and misinterpreted. Yet refusing the general's visit would itself constitute suspicious behavior that might trigger military intervention. Thomas found himself preparing for the most crucial test of his alliance with Apache groups, a confrontation that would determine whether their experiment in peaceful coexistence could survive scrutiny from the military commander responsible for Apache affairs. The stakes could hardly be higher, involving not just his personal survival, but the fate of moderate Apache factions that sought alternatives to endless warfare. His simple gesture of providing water to thirsty strangers had evolved into a political statement whose implications extended far beyond his modest ranch to influence the course of American expansion into the Southwest. The morning of General Miles's visit dawned clear and hot, with the kind of crystalline desert air that revealed details at great distances. Thomas stood on his porch watching dust clouds approach from the east, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether his alliance with Apache groups would serve as a foundation for broader peace or as evidence for prosecution that would end his life and discredit everything he had worked to achieve. The choice he had made to treat desperate enemies as human beings was about to face its ultimate test before the military officer who held the power to determine the fate of Apache resistance throughout the Southwest. As the cavalry column drew closer to his ranch, Thomas could see General Miles riding at its head, a figure whose presence embodied the full authority of the United States government and its commitment to resolving the Apache question through military force. The general's visit would mark the moment when Thomas's private moral choice became a public political statement, with consequences that would extend far beyond the boundaries of his isolated ranch to influence the course of American history in the territories of the Southwest.